Bible story makes you shock. The fall of Adam and Eve, what went wrong? Welcome to Biblical Wonders, where we embark on a peaceful, reflective journey through the sacred stories that have shaped our faith and our world. Today we explore one of the most profound and timeless stories of the Bible, the fall of Adam and Eve. It is a story that has echoed through the ages, one that continues to resonate with the deepest parts of our human nature. A tale of innocence lost, temptation embraced, and the shocking fall from grace that altered the course of history. Segment 1. The creation of man, the first breath of life. In the beginning, when God set the foundations of the earth, his creation unfolded in awe-inspiring beauty. The heavens were formed, the seas were gathered, and the land appeared full of promise and potential. The earth, once formless and empty, became a vibrant tapestry of mountains, valleys, rivers, and oceans, all created by the hands of the Creator. Yet, as majestic as the heavens and the earth were, there was still something missing. And so God, in his divine wisdom and love, decided to create something special, a being made in his image, someone who could reflect his glory and commune with him. This was the creation of man. In Genesis 1:26 we read, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.'" The creation of humanity was no accident. It was a deliberate and profound act of God's love. Man was created not from mere dust, but with a divine purpose, formed in the very likeness of God. This distinction made humanity unique in all of creation. Unlike animals or plants, humans were created with the ability to reason, create, and relate to God on a personal level. In the second chapter of Genesis, we are given a deeper account of the creation of man. God formed Adam from the dust of the ground, shaping him with care and purpose, and then, as only the Creator could, he breathed into the lifeless form the breath of life, and Adam became a living being. This act of divine breath set man apart, not only as a physical creation, but as a spiritual being capable of eternal connection with God. In Genesis 2:7 it says, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." This is not merely a physical breath. It is the spark of divine life that links humanity directly to God. The moment Adam took that first breath, he became a living soul, created for a relationship with his Maker. This breath was not just the beginning of life, but the beginning of purpose. Adam was made to live in communion with God, in a perfect world, fulfilling the divine plan set before him. God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden, a paradise unlike any other. The garden was not just a home for Adam, it was a place of perfection, a perfect environment where every need was met. The rivers flowed with crystal clear water, the air was sweet with the scent of blooming flowers, and every creature lived in harmony. The earth was good, and Adam was given the responsibility to care for it, to tend it, and to steward the land on behalf of God. In Genesis chapter 2:15 it says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." Adam's work in the garden was not a burden, it was a gift. His job was to cultivate and maintain the beauty and order of the paradise God had given him. This was not the toil of the earth that humanity would later experience after the fall, but a joyous and fulfilling task that aligned with God's creation. In the garden, Adam could walk freely and interact with every living thing. The garden was his sanctuary, and he was its caretaker. Despite the harmony and abundance surrounding him, Adam was not yet complete. For while he had the companionship of God and the animals, there was still a sense of loneliness. He needed a partner, someone who could share in this perfect world with him. A helper, not a servant, but an equal to share in the responsibility and the joy of life in Eden. In Genesis 2:18, God observes, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." And so, from Adam's side, God created Eve. The creation of Eve was not merely an afterthought, but a vital part of God's plan for humanity. Eve was made from Adam, symbolizing equality, partnership, and unity. The two were not separate in value, but were created to complement and complete each other. In Genesis 2:23, Adam exclaims, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." Here, the creation of Eve signifies the first human relationship, the foundation for family and community. Together, Adam and Eve were to walk in the garden, enjoy its bounty, and live in perfect unity, both with each other and with God. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had everything they needed: peace, provision, and the presence of God Himself. They were free to enjoy the blessings of the garden, to live in perfect harmony with each other and with the world around them. But in the midst of this paradise, God set one boundary, one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, with the command not to eat from it. This simple command would set the stage for the monumental shift in human history. And so we turn to the next part of the story, the serpent's deception, the choice to disobey, and the fall from grace. The serpent's deception, the shocking temptation, the Garden of Eden, a place of peace and perfection, stood as a testament to God's incredible creation. Adam and Eve were placed in this paradise surrounded by beauty and life in abundance. But with freedom came the choice, a divine choice that would ultimately define the course of human history. God, in His infinite wisdom, gave Adam and Eve everything they could need. They had every tree for food, a harmonious environment, and a direct, unbroken relationship with their Creator. Yet there was one boundary, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, placed at the very center of the garden. This tree, and God's simple command to refrain from eating its fruit, was meant to test their trust and obedience. In Genesis chapter 2, for verses 16 and 17, God tells Adam, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." This command, seemingly simple, held the weight of humanity's future. It was not just about the fruit, it was about trust. Would Adam and Eve trust God's definition of good and evil, or would they choose to define it for themselves? And so, we are introduced to a figure who would challenge that trust. The serpent, the embodiment of Satan, the deceiver, who sought to pull humanity away from God. Genesis chapter 3 verse 1 opens with the serpent's subtle question. Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? The serpent's question was not about the specifics of the command. It was a deliberate distortion of God's words. By implying that God's restriction was unreasonable, the serpent cast doubt on God's goodness. The idea that God would forbid something so beautiful, so desirable, seemed absurd. He was trying to plant the seed that God was withholding something good from them. Eve's response in Genesis chapter 3 verses 2 and 3 is telling, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God said you must not eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." Eve clearly remembers God's command, but notice how she adds to it. God did not say they should not touch the tree. He said they should not eat from it. This addition shows how temptation works, twisting the truth ever so slightly to make God's command seem more restrictive and severe. It opens the door to doubt. The serpent, sensing Eve's hesitation, seizes the opportunity. He delivers his ultimate lie. "You will not certainly die." Genesis chapter 3, verse 4. Here, the serpent directly contradicts God's command. He tells Eve that there are no consequences for disobedience, implying that God's warning was unnecessary, even exaggerated. The serpent goes on, "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. The temptation lay in the promise of becoming like God. The allure of knowledge, the idea of transcending their current state and gaining wisdom on par with God Himself, was irresistible. The serpent's words struck at the heart of human desire, the desire for power, knowledge, and autonomy. The serpent painted a picture of God as a being who was withholding something precious from them, something they could have if they simply defied his command. At this moment, Eve's internal struggle began. She had been in perfect harmony with God, and now she was being offered something that seemed to promise even greater fulfillment. The desire to be like God, to know what he knew, to step into his realm of wisdom was far more tempting than the simple command not to eat. And so Eve chose to trust the serpent's words over God's command. She took the fruit from the tree. In that moment, when Eve tasted the fruit, she stepped into a new reality. The immediate effects were not what she had imagined. Instead of feeling enlightened, she felt exposed. Her eyes were opened, but not to the divine wisdom she had hoped for. Instead, she saw herself and Adam for who they truly were, naked, vulnerable, and ashamed. Eve's immediate reaction is to cover herself. She grabs fig leaves and hastily sews them together to make garments, trying to hide her newfound shame. It was a futile attempt. Her innocence was gone, and with it, the harmony between her and Adam, and between humanity and God. The consequences of her choice were immediate, but they would ripple through history, affecting all of creation. The temptation had not only caught Eve, but also ensnared Adam. Rather than stepping in to correct the situation, he too ate from the tree. Genesis 3 verse 6 tells us, "She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it." Adam's disobedience was not driven by deception, as Eve's was, but by his own choice. He was not tricked by the serpent. He chose to disobey God, possibly out of love for Eve, or perhaps his own desire for the knowledge that the serpent had promised. The act of eating from the tree was not simply a physical action, it was a declaration of independence from God. It was a choice to trust in their own understanding of good and evil, rather than relying on God's perfect wisdom. In that moment, Adam and Eve's relationship with God was irrevocably changed. They no longer walked in perfect harmony with him, but were now separated by their sin. As Adam and Eve tasted the fruit, they stepped into a new reality, one filled with guilt, shame, and the awareness of their disobedience. The serenity of the garden was shattered, and in its place came the painful consequences of sin. The perfect relationship with God had been broken, and now Adam and Eve were forced to face the aftermath of their choice. But what would come next? The consequences of their actions would extend far beyond their own lives. The world itself would change forever. The consequences of disobedience, a world changed forever. The moment Adam and Eve disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, the universe was forever changed. Their sin did not just affect them. It rippled through all of creation, bringing consequences that reached far beyond that one pivotal act of eating the forbidden fruit. The serenity of the garden was shattered in an instant. The harmony between humanity and God, once perfect and unbroken, was fractured. And in that rupture, the consequences were felt not just in the hearts of Adam and Eve, but in the very fabric of the world around them. The Bible tells us in Genesis 3:7 that the moment they ate the fruit, the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. This was their first taste of shame, a feeling that had never existed before in the perfection of Eden. There, in the garden, Adam and Eve had lived without fear, without guilt, and without shame. But now, the weight of their disobedience was immediate. They saw themselves for what they had become, vulnerable, exposed, and guilty. With their eyes opened, Adam and Eve were no longer in the perfect, innocent world they once knew. Their sin had brought about an awareness of evil, a knowledge of good and evil, but not the kind of wisdom they had hoped for. Their disobedience led to spiritual death, a severing of their connection with God. The immediate consequence was the loss of peace and innocence. Their relationship with each other became strained, and their relationship with God was irrevocably altered. But as with all sin, the effects were not contained to Adam and Eve alone. The consequences extended far beyond that single moment. As they stood in the garden, attempting to hide their guilt from each other, They could no longer escape the truth. They had broken God's command. And as God's voice rang out, calling them to account, the weight of their rebellion became undeniable. God's first action in this moment was not to strike them down immediately, but to seek them out. He called to Adam, asking, "Where are you?" Genesis 3, verse 9. This question, though spoken by God, was not a question of ignorance. It was not that God did not know where Adam was physically. It was a divine invitation to Adam to face the reality of what he had done. The question, "Where are you?" was an invitation for Adam to step out of hiding, to confront his own heart, and to take responsibility for his actions. When Adam answers, his words reveal the immediate fallout of sin. "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." Genesis 3:10. The first emotion introduced into human history as a result of sin was fear. Fear of exposure, fear of judgment, and fear of separation from God. For the first time, Adam felt the weight of his guilt. The perfect peace of the garden had been replaced by the fear of the Creator. And when God asks Adam how he knew that he was naked, the truth begins to unfold. Adam and Eve's response is marked by blame, another consequence of their sin. Adam, when asked about his actions, points to Eve, saying, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." Genesis 3:12. Eve in turn points to the serpent, claiming that it deceived her. The blame shifting is immediate and profound. Adam's first reaction is not to take responsibility, but to point to someone else. First Eve, and then, indirectly, God. But God, in his justice, must address the sin. He does not let Adam and Eve's excuses stand. Instead, he pronounces the consequences that will ripple through generations. The curse of sin was not just spiritual, it was physical, emotional, and social. It touched every part of creation. First, God turns to the serpent. In Genesis 3:14-15, God declares, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." The serpent, once a creature of beauty and grace, now became cursed to crawl on its belly, symbolizing the shame and degradation brought about by sin. But in this curse, God also provided the first glimmer of hope. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. This is a prophecy of the coming Messiah who would ultimately defeat Satan and sin. Even in the judgment, God's grace and redemption are already hinted at. Next, God turns to Eve. In Genesis 3:16, God speaks to her, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." Eve's sin would have lasting consequences on her body and relationships. Childbirth, once a joy, would now be marked by pain. Her desire, which once was for mutual companionship with Adam, would now be marked by an imbalance, a struggle for control in their relationship. There would be a tension between them, a longing for her husband, yet also a need to fight for equality. Her relationship with Adam would no longer be purely harmonious. It would now carry the weight of sin. And then God turned to Adam. Genesis 3:17-19 records the consequences that would follow for him. "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." The land, which had once yielded its bounty easily, would now resist Adam's efforts. Where once his labor had been fulfilling, now it would be frustrating. The once thriving paradise would now produce thorns and thistles, and most significantly, death had entered the world. Adam, formed from the dust of the ground, would now return to it. Life was no longer eternal. With the pronouncement of these curses, Adam and Eve were not only spiritually separated from God, but were also forced to face a world that had changed irreparably. They were no longer at peace with each other, with creation, or with God. The perfection of Eden was lost, and the consequence of their actions, both personal and cosmic, was made clear. The story does not end here, though. As Adam and Eve are driven from the garden, a new chapter begins, one of pain, hope, and redemption. God did not abandon humanity in the face of sin. He began the process of redemption, even as he expelled them from the garden. Though the road ahead would be long and fraught with struggle, the story of Adam and Eve points to the greater narrative of God's ultimate plan for restoration and hope. Life after Eden, how humanity's life changed forever. As Adam and Eve are cast from the Garden of Eden, the paradise where they once lived in harmony with God, they step into a world profoundly altered by their actions. The world they knew, perfect, unspoiled and serene, was no more. They had forfeited their place in paradise, and in its place was a wilderness full of challenges. Gone were the days of effortless fellowship with God. Gone was the perfect garden with its abundance of fruit, lush vegetation, and peaceful creatures. Instead, Adam and Eve faced a harsh, unforgiving environment, a world now subject to the consequences of their sin. Adam, formed from the dust of the earth, now finds himself thrust back into a land that will no longer yield its fruit freely. His hands, once used to tending the garden in peace, now grasp the rough, unforgiving earth. The curse upon the ground has made cultivation difficult, and food no longer grows easily. The labor that once brought fulfillment now brings frustration. Genesis 3:17 records God's words to Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life." The ground will no longer cooperate. It will now yield thorns and thistles, a reminder of the brokenness that Adam and Eve's sin has introduced into the world. But it wasn't just the earth that had been cursed. The very nature of their existence had changed. The intimate relationship between Adam, Eve, and their Creator was now a distant memory. They had once walked with God in the cool of the day, enjoying intimate fellowship with Him. But now, in their fallen state, they were separated from the source of life. The peace they once knew in the garden was gone, replaced by a deep spiritual void that could no longer be filled by their own efforts. As they begin their journey outside Eden, the first consequence they experience is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of being exposed, fear of a world that now seems hostile. Adam and Eve had never experienced fear before. Fear was a byproduct of sin, a new emotion that sprang from their awareness of their nakedness. Genesis 3:10 captures this moment. "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." Before, they had been unashamed, walking in the garden without fear, fully exposed to God and each other. But now their nakedness symbolized more than just physical vulnerability. It represented their broken relationship with God and the loss of their innocence. But fear was only the beginning. With their expulsion from the garden, Adam and Eve's new life outside Eden was filled with hardship and suffering. The promise of a life of ease and beauty was now replaced with pain and labor. The thorns and thistles that would now spring from the ground were not just physical obstacles, but metaphors for the emotional, relational, and spiritual difficulties that would plague humanity for generations. The work that Adam was tasked with would no longer be fulfilling and joyful. Instead, it would be marked by exhaustion and frustration. The garden, a place of God's perfect creation, was no longer their home. In Genesis 3:19, God's words to Adam foreshadow the ultimate reality of life after Eden. "By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." This is the first mention of death in the Bible. Death was not a part of God's original design. But now, because of sin, death had entered the world. Adam, created from the dust, would return to dust. Life was no longer eternal. The very cycle of existence was now marked by mortality, and each human being born into the world would carry that burden. Despite these harsh realities, Adam and Eve were not left without hope. In the midst of their judgment, God spoke a powerful promise, the first glimmer of hope after the fall. In Genesis 3:15, God addresses the serpent, declaring, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." This prophecy, often called the proto-evangelium, meaning first gospel, pointed to a future redemption, a promise that from Eve's descendants would come a savior who would defeat the serpent. The serpent, representing Satan, would be crushed by this coming figure. This promise, though veiled in mystery, is the first indication that God's plan for redemption was already set in motion. Though sin had marred the world, God would one day provide a way for humanity to be restored. As Adam and Eve began their new life outside the garden, they experienced the realities of sin in a world that no longer reflected God's perfect creation. Yet even in the midst of their fallen state, humanity was not abandoned. They would have children, and the line of Adam and Eve would continue. Their son, Cain, would be the first to feel the effects of sin in his relationship with his brother Abel. Genesis 4:8 tells us, "Cain said to Abel, 'Let's go out to the field.' And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him." The first murder, brother against brother, was a direct result of sin's deepening hold on humanity. Cain's jealousy and rage led to Abel's death, further perpetuating the cycle of brokenness and pain that sin had unleashed. The death of Abel marked the first instance of human violence. This tragic event, born from pride, jealousy, and sin, would be repeated over and over throughout human history. And yet, even as the world became filled with more pain and suffering, the hope of redemption remained. Humanity, though fallen, would never be forsaken by God. The story of Adam and Eve's life outside of Eden is the story of all humanity. It is a story of struggle, of failure, of hardship, but also of hope. The world they left behind was perfect, but the world they entered was imperfect, marred by sin, death, and separation from God. And yet, in the midst of this fallen world, God's plan for redemption was unfolding. The promise of salvation, foreshadowed in Genesis 3:15, would one day be realized through the coming of a Savior, the very figure who would restore what was lost in Eden. Though the road ahead was one of pain, suffering, and toil, the light of hope would never completely fade. Even in the darkest moments of human history, God's promise of redemption remained. The story of Adam and Eve, their fall from grace in the Garden of Eden, and its consequences, offers profound lessons that extend far beyond the ancient biblical narrative. Here are key lessons we can draw from this story. The importance of obedience lesson. Obedience to God's commands is crucial for maintaining our relationship with Him and for living in harmony with creation. Adam and Eve's choice to disobey God's simple command not only led to their downfall, but also introduced suffering, death, and sin into the world. This highlights the importance of trusting in God's wisdom and following His guidance, even when we do not fully understand the reasons behind His commands. Reflection. Often we face choices in life that test our obedience to God's principles. The story serves as a reminder of the consequences of going our own way, rather than trusting in God's perfect plan for us. The nature of temptation lesson. Temptation often begins with subtle doubts and questions about God's goodness and intentions. The serpent did not force Adam and Eve to sin, but used cunning words to sow seeds of doubt about God's command. He made them question whether God truly wanted the best for them. Temptation often comes in the form of appealing lies that promise personal gain, but these promises are empty and ultimately lead to harm. Reflection. Understanding the nature of temptation helps us resist it. We must be cautious when doubts about God's goodness or instructions arise in our hearts. Trusting in God's love and wisdom protects us from the deception of sin. The consequences of sin. Lesson: Sin has real and far-reaching consequences. Adam and Eve's disobedience resulted in spiritual death, physical toil, pain, and ultimately, separation from God. The curse upon them affected not only their lives, but the entire world, introducing suffering, decay, and death. This is a reminder that every choice we make has consequences, some of which are personal, while others ripple through generations. Reflection. Understanding the consequences of sin helps us to be mindful of our actions. It calls us to recognize that sin affects not just our lives, but also the lives of others, sometimes in ways that are beyond our immediate understanding. Humanity's struggle with sin. Lesson. The fall of Adam and Eve shows us that humanity's struggle with sin is inherent in human nature. Though Adam and Eve lived in a perfect environment with direct communion with God, they still succumbed to temptation. This reflects the vulnerability of human beings to sin. Even with all the good that God created, there remains within humans a propensity to choose self over God. Reflection. This story shows that we are not alone in our struggle with sin. It teaches us humility, recognizing our own weaknesses, and calls us to seek God's strength and grace to overcome temptation. The relationship between free will and sin. Lesson. The story demonstrates that God gave Adam and Eve free will, the ability to choose. Without this free will, they would have been mere puppets, unable to genuinely love or obey God. The fall of humanity is not just about disobedience, it's about the misuse of free will. God allows us to make choices, but with that freedom comes responsibility for the consequences of those choices. Reflection. Free will is a gift that God has given to each of us, and how we use it matters. The fall teaches us the value of making wise, righteous choices, recognizing that our decisions shape not only our lives, but also the world around us. The loss of innocence and the entrance of shame. Lesson. Before sin entered, Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed, living in perfect innocence. After their disobedience, they became aware of their nakedness, and with that awareness came shame. Sin brings guilt, shame, and an awareness of our imperfections. What was once pure and untainted is now marked by human weakness and vulnerability. Reflection. Sin brings a sense of guilt that separates us from others and from God. However, the story also shows that God, even in the midst of judgment, provides a path to healing. Understanding the impact of sin on our relationships with others and with God calls us to seek His forgiveness and redemption. Promise of redemption. Lesson. Even in the wake of humanity's first sin, God's plan for redemption was set into motion. The Genesis 3:15 prophecy, known as the Proto-Evangelium, foretold that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head, offering hope for eventual victory over sin. This promise pointed to Jesus Christ, who would come to defeat sin and death and restore humanity's relationship with God. Reflection. The fall is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of God's redemptive plan for humanity. While the consequences of sin are profound, God's mercy and promise of restoration are even greater. This is the ultimate hope that each of us can hold on to, that no matter how far we fall, God's grace is always available to restore us. God's justice and mercy. Lesson. The fall of Adam and Eve shows both God's justice and mercy. While He pronounced judgment on them for their disobedience, He also promised redemption and gave them the opportunity to have children and live on. Even in the midst of sin and punishment, God's mercy was evident. He did not abandon Adam and Eve, but clothed them and provided a way forward. Reflection. The balance of justice and mercy in God's character teaches us about His nature. He is just in holding humanity accountable for its actions, but He is also merciful, always providing a path for reconciliation. As we confront our own failures, we can find comfort in knowing that God's justice is tempered with His great mercy. The consequences of choices across generations. Lesson. The decisions made by Adam and Eve didn't just affect them, they affected all of humanity. The effects of their disobedience reached far beyond their lifetimes, influencing the lives of their children and generations to come. This teaches us that our choices don't just impact us. They can have lasting effects on those around us and on future generations. Reflection. We must be mindful of the legacy we leave. The choices we make, whether for good or ill, will shape the future in ways we may not fully comprehend. This story challenges us to live in a way that reflects God's love and righteousness, so that we may leave a legacy of faith and obedience. The hope of reconciliation with God lesson. The fall of Adam and Eve is not just a tale of loss. It is the first step in God's greater plan for reconciliation. Even as Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden, God did not leave them without hope. The promise of a future Savior, the Redeemer who would one day restore all things, was made. This ultimate restoration came through Jesus Christ, whose death and resurrection opened the door for reconciliation between God and humanity. Reflection. The story of Adam and Eve teaches us that no matter how far we fall, God's desire is for us to be restored to Him. The hope of reconciliation is central to the gospel. Through Christ, we are offered forgiveness, healing, and the restoration of our relationship with God. In this world filled with its troubles and tribulations, we are reminded that though we may face hardships and suffering, God's redemption plan continues. The story of Adam and Eve teaches us about the consequences of sin, but it also offers us the promise of a better tomorrow. Through the coming of Christ, the Messiah, the one who would crush the serpent's head, humanity finds hope. As we reflect on the lessons from Eden, let us remember that though we live in a broken world, God is still at work, redeeming and restoring what was lost. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the beginning of human history with biblical wonders. As we move forward, may we always remember that even in our struggles, God's promise of redemption is never far.